Hi, I'm Beth Comstock. I'm here with Tim O'Reilly. We're doing a Changemakers Book Club. Thanks for doing this, Tim.
I really appreciate it.
Well, the book is WTF. So how could we not do a session on WTF? But it's incredibly profound and thoughtful. It's what's the future and why it's up to us. And I think it's both insightful and optimistic and scary and all those things. Is why the title? Why now for the book?
Well, WTF is a wonderful expression for today because we do live in the WTF economy. You know, it's a period where everything is amazing and everything is horrible. And WTF is an expression that can encompass both of those things. And of course, it was when I used it as a keynote for this White House event that I had to come up with an alternate explanation for what WTF stood for.
You were pretty bold, taking this to the White House.
Yeah, but of course it stands for what everybody means by it. But I do think it is a good expression to say what's the future. But the most important part of the title is and why it's up to us.
Yeah.
Because it's really about the choices that we have to make as a society, and that we can make them still. That we're not in the middle of this inevitable race to the bottom driven by technology in the market.
Yeah, it's empowering. So I'm going to take a minute and remind you who Tim is. I mean, not that you need an introduction, but Tim O'Reilly, an entrepreneur, a futurist, even though I think that's probably a phrase you may not like so much. A thought leader. Tim founded and has scaled O'Reilly Media. You had this great description in the book. I want to read the book jacket. You said you're the founder and CEO of O'Reilly Media, a company that's been providing the picks and shovels of learning to the Silicon Valley gold rush for the past 35 years. I thought that was just so beautifully done. And you are the go-to person. I think of as tech's been emerging in those 35 years, all the trends you've spotted, you've helped make sense of, certainly in the Web 2.0 world, big data you named. At GE, we went to you when we were thinking about the industrial internet. Is it real? How do you help us make sense of it? So
I just did a dinner with Bill Rue last week
and
a bunch of GE customers and other thought leaders.
So you're the one we all turn to when we want to say, help us make sense of this change. And I think you've tried to distill that down into the book. So talk a bit more. You talked about, before you do that, I want to say we're taking questions, comments. Feel free to give them to us. Some of you have sent some in advance. We'll give them back to you, but we're trying to make this an interactive session. So you talked about that duality, that tension of excitement about the future and panic. Why? I mean, why are we at this point in time, and why do we have such extreme feelings about change and progress?
There's a fabulous passage in one of Ernest Hemingway's novels in which a character is asked, how did you go bankrupt? And he says 2 ways, gradually, then suddenly. And I think technological change is like that too.
Yeah, I use that exact same metaphor.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah,
it's Mike, right? It was Mike was the character.
That's right. Yeah,
I love that one.
And it's that gradually people are becoming aware that the world is different in ways that they don't understand, and then suddenly there's a breakthrough. And it's interesting because the gradually part just often looks pretty bad, and people get a lot of things wrong, and then suddenly we understand that we have to rethink things completely. And that's really in some ways an overarching metaphor in the book, which is how to think about the future, because if you look at some of the great breakthroughs, and let's just take a relatively recent one. Uber and Lyft, which feature fairly prominently.
And I want to get into
in the
this
book.
because you have some really thoughtful ways of
and
looking at the business models of that.
That's right. We had connected taxi cabs before Uber and Lyft. We used the old business model, which was we put a credit card in the back, so it was a slight update to handing the driver some cash or having them swipe a card in through some manual reader, and we put a TV screen in the back. We were being modern. We will show you news and ads.
And then it got to be a distraction and annoying.
Yeah, it was totally annoying. And then, only a few years later, a number of people all at once start to understand the possibilities of connecting passengers and drivers in real time using smartphones. And we completely rethought the business model. But even then, you can see how individual players only got part of the model. Sunil Paul actually wrote a lot of patents, or wrote a patent in 2000, in which he described how how phones, and it wasn't even smartphones, it was sort of texting and so on, could be used to connect, cars and enable all kinds of different business models. And then in 2008, Garrett Camp and Travis Kalanick came up with the idea of summoning black cars. Now again, they were originally using text messaging. They eventually kind of figured out the smartphone thing. But the part that we think of as so central to the business model was really invented by Sunil at Sidecar and by Logan Green and John Zimmer at Lyft. And they were actually using sort of these swarming algorithms of bringing people, ordinary people in, but not with this magical user experience of connecting people, with this app. And of course, Lyft jumped on that right away, and effectively, the modern smartphone world was really built by Lyft first, not Uber.
Yeah.
And Uber, didn't like the idea of ordinary people using their cars.
But you talk about magical experience. I mean, one of the things you said in the book is you said that with innovation and disruptive innovation in particular, which I think we're all seeing, Uber and Lyft certainly are, you say it seems unbelievable at first. It changes the way the world works, and it results in an ecosystem of new services, jobs, business models, and industries. I mean, that's asking a lot, but you're pointing out it's not just one act. There are a whole series of things that are coming together.
It's so funny because we have this historical blindness. Actually, I call this framing blindness.
Yeah.
And it's the same framing blindness that gave us the credit card reader and the screen in the back of the cab rather than Uber and Lyft. Also makes us think, wow, we're getting rid of retail jobs. Nobody's going to have a job anymore. And I go, first of all, look at history. When we put the hand weavers out of work with those milling machines, we made fabric so cheap that we could democratize fashion, and think of all the
new jobs,
the clothing and the cloth and the textiles have been created since then. But also just look at even a modern area. I talk in the book about one of these really powerful principles which Clay Christensen articulated in 2004. He called it the law of conservation of attractive profits. When one thing becomes a commodity, something else becomes valuable.
Say that again. I think that one's really important for people to think about.
He called it the law of conservation of attractive profits. When one thing becomes a commodity, something else becomes valuable. Now this was...
You want to make sure you're on the right side of that.
Yeah, that's right. And I first really encountered this. Clay and I were speaking at the same conference, and I was telling the story of how software was becoming a commodity and big data was becoming valuable. And then Clay was giving this talk. I forget what it was, some historical business analogy, and he kind of introduced this law, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's a name for what I'm talking about too. And he and I had a really great mind meld. But you see it in something like coffee. There's a wonderful segment in Alexis Madrigal's Containers podcast about container shipping. And episode 3 is about the decline of the longshoremen. And then episode 4 takes you to this gigantic coffee warehouse somewhere in the East Bay. Because what's happened and I talk about this in the book, I actually hadn't heard his coffee episode yet, but this idea that we add ideas to food to make it more valuable again. Yeah. And single origin coffee from a specialty roaster is exactly that.
It's Howard Schultz and Starbucks.
Well, it's not just Howard Schultz and Starbucks. It's all kinds of small specialty roasters.
They have kept it going, right?
And the thing that's so interesting is it even has recreated the longshoremen, because it turns out those container loads of coffee now get broken up in these warehouses because some particular roaster you need some from Sumatra, you need some from Costa Rica,
everywhere.
And so he's not taking a full container load. Yeah. And so they're breaking them up and repacking them, and it's crazy.
So let's talk about some of the pattern recognition. You talk quite a bit. Many of the questions we got in advance were kind of the how-to of how do you see the future. And I think you say in the book you don't see the future, but you certainly see patterns.
Yeah, you see patterns in the present.
Talk us through how you do that. I have a specific question here from Rob Spurka. So let's dig into that, and I'll give you Rob's question. Rob says, one factor that will be a hurdle for most people is the awareness of these emerging technologies and the solutions. What credible source of sorting, evaluating, and cataloging, and the solutions that rise to the surface, how do you get the credible sources? How do you, the signal from the noise, is what I interpret from his question.
Well, I think the first thing that you have to do is watch what's happening loosely. There's a wonderful phrase from scenario planning called News from the Future. And I feel like this is what I've always done. I have some ideas about a direction. And if this direction is true, certain kinds of news will show up. You know, so and those directions are often deep trends that many of us know about.
So you have a bit of a hypothesis.
You have
or
a
something?
hypothesis. That's right. You know, so many years ago, I remember, you know, somebody saying, "Oh, people talk all the time about Moore's law, but it's actually storage and storage getting cheaper that's going to have this huge impact." And that stuck in my head. And so then I started watching that and being aware of it and noticing, well, if that's the case, certain kinds of things are going to happen. And then they do. So you build a library of mental models of things to just be aware of and
Are
to
you
recognize.
naturally that way, or your role as a media person where you see so much? I mean, have you had to train yourself to be that way?
There were really two things that trained me to do that. And the first was from you know, growing up in San Francisco in the 60s, I was exposed to
we don't want to know what you're exposed to. Maybe we do. That's your next book.
I was exposed to a body of work that really was literally training in how to do that. It was a guy named George Simon. I actually led workshops at Esalen when I was 18 years old.
That was a good book, maybe a movie.
Yeah. And it was a lot about...
And you talk about it in the book.
Yeah, how do you take just raw data in more uncritically and follow the process of abstraction? Many of us live in a world of received knowledge and labels. And there actually is a sort of almost a psychological process you can follow to understand whether you're just taking in data, taking in experience, and when you're in the process of sorting it out and telling stories about it.
So that's optimistic. I mean, you've taught that, so you know it can be learned.
Yes, it can be learned. And then that was one piece. The other thing that played an enormous role early in my career as a technical writer, I was a non-technical person. My formal education was in Greek and Latin classics. Now, of course, if you take up ancient Greek when you're 18 years old and are reading, you don't know that you don't pick it up, normally as you pick up another language. You're basically parsing these texts and reading them, and you kind of know that's a verb and that's a noun, and you're kind of looking at it and reading it over and over again until all of a sudden the pattern falls into place. So in a way, it's a lot like doing puzzles.
Yeah.
And so I kind of had it in translating Greek and Latin. I ended up kind of building this pattern recognition capability, which when I started doing technical writing, it was literally all these words were gibberish. I didn't know what they were talking about, but I could see what order they went in.
Well, and you made a business out of explaining to people.
Yes, that's right. And that was the thing that was so remarkable, I think, about many of my early books. Even when I didn't necessarily understand the technology well, I was able to explain it because I was able to say, well, it's pretty clear that this goes before that, and you have to understand this first. And so putting things in the right order is an important skill.
Yeah. So I'm reminding people, please send in your questions, comments. We've got many already in advance. You talk about seeing the future. You talk about building maps that show business models, what comes in. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe go back to Uber and explain how, I think that's a really good set of tools and capabilities.
Yeah, there's a wonderful lesson I learned from some consultants, Dan and Meredith Beam, in 2000. We brought them into O'Reilly to help us sort out how to integrate all of our different businesses, because we had, we'd been a book publisher, we'd started doing conferences, we had online services that we were beginning to build. And their central lesson was that a business model is the way that all of the parts of a business work together to create customer value and marketplace advantage. And they gave us an example, Southwest Airlines, and just as a way of saying, look, compare Southwest and United or American or any other airline, and you see there's something different about them. Saying that they're an airline is not enough to explain their business model. Southwest has point-to-point routes, no baggage forwarding, no assigned seating. There's all of these things that work together to make them able to deliver services at lower cost. They also had a strong employee union, employee wages, employee stock ownership, and all these things were part of their business model. So translate that forward at O'Reilly. We were like, okay, our fundamental business is connecting people who know things with people who need to know them. And that's common across our conferences, across our books. Oh, and now we can build this online learning platform, which is what Safari has become. Oh, we can start a venture capital firm. Oh, we can start a magazine, Make Magazine and Maker Faire, because they're all expressions of that business model of connecting people, and we characterize our business model as changing the world by spreading the knowledge of innovators, instead of we put books on shelves and we also put butts in seats.
Yeah.
You know?
So when you look at these maps, like what are some interesting things you're spotting now, and
Yeah.
and what are maybe some big disruptions that you're seeing by doing that?
Well, a couple of things. It's so important to realize that, like a term like, well, we use the advertising business model is not sufficient. So if you look at Google, they came up with a unique spin on the advertising business model, which is that somebody comes to their site for search, and if they find the right answer, they go away. And then they did the same thing with ads, where they've spent all of this work and all of this intelligence building algorithms for relevance, where people go away on the first click. And Facebook, on the other hand, wants you to come and stay.
That's why we're doing this on Facebook first.
Yeah, and if you look at how Google is acting today, they're playing Facebook's game. They've forgotten their own business model. Rather than sending someone off to Yelp, say, or TripAdvisor, they say, well, it's better if you actually come to Google and get your information here. And that actually, I think, is putting them in a position of weakness. And that also highlights another really important thing to learn about business models. All of these companies, these great tech companies, are platforms. And a platform has to work for all of the participants. They're matching marketplaces. And I spend a lot of time in the book talking about this marketplace dynamic and how companies are increasingly becoming network marketplaces. And so if you look at the truth of a marketplace, is that it succeeds when it creates a thick set of matches between people who are providing
In fact, you
something.
call it a thick marketplace.
That's,
So
right. That's right. That's a term that came from a wonderful book called Who Gets What and Why by Alvin E. Roth.
How do you create a thick one?
Well, there's a variety of ways, and sometimes it's by algorithm. If you look at exactly what Uber and Lyft did, was they basically, there's a couple of key things. They created a mechanism where anybody could come into the market because those workers are upskilled using GPS-based applications, so that you can have, and they're rated by customer ratings and various mechanisms like that, so you can have a much larger supply. And then they have to they spend a lot of money trying to attract customers, and then they can bring them together in real time. So it's actually a much more efficient marketplace than, say, the taxi marketplace, where if you're in New York, well, at least you can stand on a street corner and find someone. But if you're in Oakland, where I live, the chance of getting a cab was extremely small.
Yeah.
There's not enough cabs, and there's not enough people in the same place. But I can get a lift in 3 minutes at my home.
Yeah,
and so technology can create new ways of matching marketplaces. But you also see that Uber forgot that the drivers really matter.
Yeah.
And I think Lyft is gaining share.
But you make a good case in the book about
Yeah.
humanity and the human touch. And
that's right.
It's not just about algorithms.
No, of course not. I think the whole, we're demonizing algorithms today. And we're demonizing the wrong algorithms, in my opinion. It's very important to understand an algorithm is simply a set of rules for doing something. And they exist digitally, but they also exist in our everyday life. And when I think a lot about one of the extended arguments in the book, there's really 4 parts in the book. The first one is sort of entitled How to Think About the Future. The second one is about the nature of platforms and this idea of matching marketplaces and what I've learned from technology platforms about marketplaces. And then the third part is about what it means to manage and be managed by algorithms. Yeah. And the thing that's really interesting is, so I start with explaining for people who don't necessarily understand how these things work, just what it means to build the kinds of algorithms that they have at Google and the role that AI is starting to play. And then in
I think that's a really important one reason for people to dig into the book, and that's dig into it in general. But I think there's people throw the word AI around, but you take the time to explain. You talk about weak, strong AI. I mean, you give people a real sense of it.
Well, I also I don't really go into AI very deeply. I think the main point that I want to really make is to demystify the idea. First of all, they're not yet that intelligent. But secondly, they do what we tell them. I use the analogy that we're building these systems that are a lot like the genies of Arabian mythology. Everybody knows the story. You have 3 wishes. You give them the wish, and you didn't phrase the wish quite right, you get it wrong. And this is exactly the story of Facebook and fake news. Their wish was, we will make, we will give people more of what they like and what they share. And that got exploited. And I think we now have to ask ourselves, in our economy, it's also ruled by an algorithm. And it's also giving us more of what we have told it to do. But was that what we really wanted?
Yeah. We've got a number of questions just to dig in here. We're talking about platforms, AI. A question from Dave Toole. He says, how do we transition and let go of things that built our industrial age in order to adapt to the information age in a competitive way? And another question from Anita Alexander says, what would you have conglomerates, what recommendations do you have for conglomerates to engage their current workforce and test and shape the future?
Yeah.
So really the old to the new, what works?
Well, I think the biggest issue that we have in our economy is actually that we have overemphasized two of many players. An economy is a multi-player marketplace. And if economists talk about the biggest problem in our economy today is the lack of aggregate demand. What they mean by that is that ordinary people don't have enough money to spend. We kick the can down the road by telling people, well, just if you don't have enough, if your income isn't growing, just borrow it. People then build up massive amounts of debt, and they go, well, we can't afford to do that. We said, oh, okay, well, you can, all the members of your family can work. All these kinds of things were short-term ways to keep an unsustainable system going. And so the first thing that companies have to do is they have to invest more in workers. We've given enormous amounts of the value produced by our new kinds of productivity to two parties, to consumers in the form of lower prices, and that's good because those workers are also consumers. Yeah. And we've given it to the owners of businesses in the form of increased corporate profits. And that's not enough because we've also said, hey, guess what? People are a cost to be eliminated. And I think there's some real interesting historical lessons that I talk a bit about in the book from what happened after World War I and what happened after World War II. After World War I, we punished the losers. We pushed the world into Great Depression, hyperinflation in Germany, leading to the rise of fascism in World War II. After World War II, we rebuilt Europe and Japan. We told our returning soldiers, we want to put you to work. The GI Bill, go back to school, buy a farm. Go look at the ads. Buy a farm, buy a business. We invested in people. We had because they were afraid of what happened after. Yeah. And then we forgot. We always forget history. And so, and then we start, and of course, all of those things that we did after World War II were an adaptation to circumstance, and like all of our adaptations, they didn't work forever. And then we just went too far the other way. We said, well, unions, that was a way of giving, power to workers, and look at what happened. And so let's end that, and let's undercut the power of unions without realizing that, well, maybe that mechanism, that, tool didn't work, but we need to try again to make sure that there's enough money circulating through the system, that we pay people more, that we invest. And I think in this way, education is this huge part of it. And I don't mean, let's send people to, graduate school or more college or coding camps.
Is it everybody coding more? I mean, that's not what you're talking about, right?
No, I don't think that that's really...
And to that point, we have two questions. Dagmar Ebaugh asks, how can education do better at teaching us to think critically versus just teaching us to use tech? I think that may be where you're going. And then Sangeeta Patil asks, given the pace of tech innovations, how can education models adapt, and how can leaders help businesses adapt? And that's what you're getting at. How do you answer them?
Well, I think that one of the fundamental issues that we have is that we have this idea that companies should be able to go to the job market like it's a supermarket and pick somebody fully qualified, perfectly adapted for their needs off the shelf. What we have to actually adopt in companies is the idea that people are a capital asset that you invest in. When I think about my own business, I hired people in the early days when my company was a tech writing firm who none of my clients would ever have hired. I hired them on the basis of their raw talent. I sold myself. I said, I'll give you the manual that that you need, and then I hired these people. Dale Doherty, who started the Maker Room, is a great example. I hired him out of a technical writing program. He was green, and I saw he had talent, and then we worked together, and he built his skills and became this amazing force in the technology industry. And I think of all these people that I trained up, and we wrote the manuals for people because I knew they could do it with some help and guidance.
So you're talking about training. Brian Mattamore asks, futurists agree that the single most important success for the future is creative problem solving. That's part of what you're talking. So you're training people to figure it out. I mean, that's what you did with Dale.
Absolutely. Creative problem solving is a huge part of it. I think also, though, we have to understand that, people are not just cogs in this business to be used up and thrown away. There is this idea, and it's even in our financial statements, and this kind of comes back to this idea of our framing metaphors and our framing blindness. If you look at a company financial statement, people are a cost. The thing we're trying to optimize for is this, we call it the bottom line. And if you can actually get rid of people, great.
As opposed to speed to learning, amplification of learning, return on learning.
And the thing that's so interesting, I love the story about Amazon adding robots to their warehouses, because it came up, the statistics I learned after I had finished writing the book. But from the period of 2014 to the middle of 2016, Amazon added 45,000 robots to their warehouses. And they added 250,000 workers. Now, why is that? And I want to contrast that with a story I had from an investor who was telling me he just invested in an AI company that he said would put 30% of call center workers out of a job. And I said, why aren't you making call centers better? Because that's what Jeff did with the Amazon warehouses. He didn't say, we're going to do the same thing with half as many workers. He said, wow, we pack more products in there. We can get more products onto next day delivery. Oh, we can get more. We can actually get in a lot of zip codes. We can get products on same day delivery.
If I took you today to Cincinnati, Ohio, where our global operations is, you'd find a similar story where back office teams are entrepreneurial, using algorithmic robots to make their jobs better.
That's right.
Part of it is an education, right, of how to use the tools.
Yeah, and it's a mindset.
It's a mindset.
It is. First of all, the mindset in company management has to be, do more. Do things that didn't used to be possible. And you see this with great entrepreneurs like Elon Musk today, tackling all these crazy problems. But then you have to say, okay, and now how do we give people superpowers in our company so they can do more?
How do we do that?
Well, I think increasingly...
If you're watching this right now, or you're watching one of our clips, tomorrow someone's going to go out and say, I'm going to do this. What would you recommend?
Well, I think the first thing you have to understand is that we are now building a new class of intelligent tools that basically are kind of cognitive augmentation. Everybody can understand that a power tool, or like a bulldozer, steam shovel, is this massive augmentation of human muscle. A GPS-based app that allowed somebody to pick up a passenger at some randomly selected point and without any prior skill.
You didn't have to just be a cabbie in London to do that.
Yeah, that's right. That's a cognitive augmentation. When you can build a tool, Nick Pinkston at CloudFab has this great idea of interfaces that teach. So build products that actually teach and train people, empower people. I think there's enormous potential with augmented reality in that area. Where we're going to have knowledge on demand. I don't think we're that far from that kind of great scene in The Matrix where Trinity says, I need to know how to fly a helicopter, and they download the knowledge into her brain, and then she jumps into the helicopter and flies.
It's exciting to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously.
What would you do if you had that power? Do you have a skill you would do?
Well, I think probably the skill I would do is I'd love to be an opera singer.
Yeah. Well, I would like to be a better musician. I would like to be a musician, so maybe I can play for your opera. So, one of the questions that's come in is from Senior Mayman, and Senior says, so what are you most frustrated by that isn't changing?
Well, I'm very frustrated by our political policy discussion. It seems like we have this set menu. You know, like for example, look at the tax debate. You know, taxes are too high, they're too low, but we're all just basically moving a slider as if there's only this one rail. And I think about, one of the things I think about the economy is that a huge amount of what we call, quote, investment is not really investment, it's gambling. You know, when Carl Icahn bought $3.6 billion of Apple stock, he wasn't making an investment in Apple. Apple didn't need his money. He was placing a bet on Apple stock. And not only that, he was trying to manipulate Apple stock so that it would go up. He was trying to persuade them to do buybacks. When Trian Partners bought stock in GE, same thing. You know, it's like, can we get this stock to go up? Can we push the company to optimize this thing that isn't actually good for anyone except these gamblers? Because ultimately what GE needed to do and what Apple needed to do, I think, is to work more in the real economy. You know, why is it better for Apple to do stock buybacks to make Carl Icahn richer? We have this philosophy that it is, than to say, well, you know, we're making so much money that we could in fact make our phones at higher cost in the U.S. You know, we don't have to go to China and pay suicide level wages and working conditions. You know, Apple clearly has plenty of money, you know, and we have this kind of this unquestioning belief that our financial system, which demands ever higher profits, is somehow an unalloyed good, despite all the evidence that it's actually taking investment away from our actual society. You know, like if our companies were saying, yeah, we're actually going to have slightly lower profits, and we're going to have better working conditions, lower wages, shorter working hours.
I mean, you write in the book, the evidence is in. It's time we rewrite the rules. This rule doesn't work. We need to play the game of business as if people matter. I mean, that's right. That hasn't. You feel like that still hasn't changed enough?
No, it really hasn't. And it's so amazing because you look at a company, say like REI. REI is a co-op. You know, if you compare them, say, to Columbia Sportswear, one of their large public market competitors, their same-store sales are better, their growth in same-store sales are better. All of the metrics that you would use to describe a real business where, you know, in the world of Adam Smith's invisible hand, people are exchanging goods and services. They do better than their public market competitors. But they don't make money for the stock market because they're a co-op.
So you had some questions from people about purpose, and so you're also saying bring purpose, remind people of the purpose.
That's right.
It's not that's not a technological answer.
No, it's not a technological answer at all. It's you know, I've said for years, work on stuff that matters. You know, money in your business is like gas in your car. You know, it's a way to get somewhere. Where are you going? You know, when you go on a road trip, you are not taking a tour of gas stations. You know, and I feel like so many companies have forgotten that. And of course, the thing is, that's bad for business. It's bad for business to forget it because it takes away, first of all, this incredible advantage that you have when you have purpose. You know, you look at you know, someone like Elon, an incredible, you know, advances in marketing, in you know, because people respond to the bold visions.
Yeah, they love vision.
They love the idea that we want to change the world for the better.
That's how you make markets.
That's right.
So you quote John Maynard Keynes, and you talk about his notion of technological unemployment. Before we move on, I just want to hit that because people are worried what you're talking about, but also technology is going to replace them. And you talk about sort of there's a period of time. How do we help people get over that fear of I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to lose my job?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, it's really important to understand when Keynes coined that term, technological employment, in 1929, he didn't mean technology putting people out of work. He meant technology putting people out of work faster than we could put them back to work. You know, so faster than we could adapt. So clearly the question is we can either slow down the putting people out of work or, more productively, we can work harder on putting them back to work. And I think that the thing that keeps us from doing that, there's actually probably a lot of things, and we need a lot of experiments.
Yeah.
But the first thing I think is we need to look at the places where our markets are failing us. Free markets are the most powerful engine of human prosperity that we've ever seen. And yet they don't get everything right. I love that this line from Larry Summers. He once refuted the efficient markets hypothesis with the cutting line. He said, "There are idiots, look around." and I feel like you can also say, there's work to be done, look around.
Yeah, there's a lot of work.
Why are we not doing it? And so to me, debugging our economy. A friend of mine, Andrew Singer, now deceased unfortunately, in the early days of Macintosh programming, said something wonderful to me. He said, the art of debugging a computer program is finding out what you really told it to do instead of what you thought you told it to do. And understanding that there are bugs in our economy is one of the big things we can take from tech. When there is work, like you look at our crumbling infrastructure and you ask yourself, why aren't we fixing it? When you look at the fact that there are people, older people who aren't getting care, when you look at the fact that our healthcare system is clearly broken, and costing way more than it should, what's keeping us from fixing it? Why aren't we debugging our economy and saying, well, the ways that we have told, the ways that we believe things should work are clearly wrong, just like that, screen in the back of the taxi cab.
Yeah. So I think let's wrap up with this the way you wrap up the book, which is it's up to us. I mean, it's the second part of your book. You say what's the future and why it's up to us. I'm going to wrap a couple of questions together. So Shida Gupta says, in the era of emerging technology, how can we ensure that technology remains an enabler and not a substitute for human intelligence? And that's really what you're talking about. It's up to us.
Yeah.
And then Brian Mattimore says, what role could technology actually play in facilitating and helping us get to these skills faster? And then maybe talk a little bit about some of what's up to us. How do we do that?
Okay, so first thing, in terms of skills, it's pretty clear that we have built an amazing infrastructure for knowledge on demand. I have a 14-year-old stepdaughter, and I tell a story in the book of the time she asked, she was early 13 at the time, if she could make dinner for this business dinner we were having at the house. And my wife, with some trepidation, said yes, because it was sort of high profile.
They were both very
brave. And she brings in this dessert that would be perfect at a high-end restaurant. It's these thin chocolate eggshell cups, with a scoop of ice cream and a smattering of berries. And we said afterwards, how did you make those cups? She said, oh, well, I blow up a balloon and you dip the chocolate. And I said, how did you learn that? She said, it was on YouTube. I think she's actually, or she saw it. I think she saw it on Instagram originally,
and figured out how to go find it.
And that ability of kids, and there's a wonderful book about this by John Seeley Brown and John Hagel, The Power of Pull. This ability to pull in information. So I think we have enormous educational capabilities. And my own company's Safari Online platform, which is all about, it's tens of thousands of ebooks, conference presentations, training video, and live online training, is an example of the kinds of corporate learning services that we have today. So I think empowering people to tackle hard problems. Everybody in my world, and this is something else that's so critical, we built the web not because somebody taught us in school how to do it. We built the web because we were having fun, and we saw what other people were doing, and we were able to copy them and learn from each other. And I think we could create that kind of learning environment around problem solving. And I think that would be a wonderful
So
way
I hear
to
you
go.
say kind of work to learn as much as anything.
Absolutely.
And then learn to work.
That's right.
You talk a couple of the points that you make, and it's up to us. You say ask good questions. I mean, that's something you've learned how to do. share knowledge rather than hoarding it. That's what you're talking
That's
about.
right. Yeah.
Know how to ask the right kind of questions. And then you talk about the human touch. Like I keep going around. This is me saying, like, in the age of robots, it's all about don't give up on your creativity. But
Yeah.
you make a really good case here for morality and human touch. I mean, maybe we end with some thoughts from you on that.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things there, and one of them starts with something that sounds like the most heartless libertarian comment, and that's Hal Varian.
You are from
of
Silicon
Google.
Valley, right?
Yeah. Hal Varian once said, if you want to understand the future, just look at what rich people do today. And you hear it and you go, oh my God, how could somebody say that? And then you think about it for a minute and you go, oh yeah, rich people used to go on the grand tour. Now soccer hooligans do it, rich people had cell phones. Now everybody has cell phones.
They have their own black car driver.
Rich people, yeah, exactly. We've democratized, the kind of having access to this. All these technologies are coming down in price and becoming common. Well, so what do rich people do today that we are not doing? I'll give you a couple of examples. They send their children to schools with very small class sizes, with highly paid teachers. So just imagine that for a minute. If we said, okay, everybody should have that. We would say, oh, we're going to have to put a lot more money into education. We're going to put a lot of people into work, because instead of having, our public school students in classes of 30, we're going to have them in classes of 8, just like the rich people do. And you go, wow, we need 3 or 4 times as many teachers as we have today. That's a huge way of putting people to work in a caring role. And you think about, oh my gosh, all the people who are aging parents, and you think about, oh, there's a fabulous hack on the number of working hours. It's called parental leave, and extending that to taking care of parents and other kinds of caring is a way of starting to jumpstart a caring economy, because it's not just, and then of course figuring out how to make those more valuable. But I also think that we need to understand creativity writ large. And there are jobs that we have created privileged positions for in creativity. I think of university professors, for example, tenured university professors. And I go, well, maybe we need more people to have tenure of some kind.
Yeah, and what does that mean?
What does that mean in a way of, you look at, big companies have rediscovered that. Somebody becomes a distinguished engineer, and they work on what they work on.
Yeah, give them the freedom.
Yeah, and I think we could.
So you're very optimistic, and you're saying it's up to us. It's up to us to grab these capabilities we have.
Yeah, the biggest thing that I think people have been asking me, well, who is this we, and what do you want us to do? And
we is everybody here.
That's right. And there's a couple of, there's a macro version of that and a micro version of it. And the macro version is that what we collectively believe shapes our society. 250 years ago, we collectively believed in the divine right of kings. And some group of people said, no, we don't believe that anymore. And they were willing to put their lives on the line to change that. I remember Benjamin Franklin once said, if we don't all hang together, gentlemen, we will assuredly all hang separately. We forget that the founders of this country were rebels who, if they had not succeeded, would have been hung.
They had a lot of risk.
They brought a lot of risk, and we have to take some risks to build this better society. But we first have to believe in it. And that change of belief that we actually now have enough productivity in our society that we no longer need to say, well, wow, all of our economy needs to be focused on incenting productivity, and instead say, let's go reinvent it. Let's figure out what makes that work. And then in the small, I think we have to look at the way that we are enmeshed in these digital systems and take more control of them. And I've been proposing to people just a simple experiment, because there's a lot of hating on Facebook these days, and they're mind control and they're influencing us and so on. And I go, and we're playing right along with it. And you can do a simple experiment, and I ask each of you to do this. If you use Facebook or whatever other social network you
hopefully
like.
they're watching now. They're using
Yes, that's
Facebook.
right.
We know that.
So instead of sharing or liking any news articles at all, just like and share personal updates from your friends. And you will see that Facebook shows you personal updates from your friends, and becomes that network that Facebook originally envisioned. And then, just for the heck of it, start sharing and clicking on articles of your choice, whatever topic, and you'll get more of them. And you go, oh my gosh, we are training, those algorithms are being trained by each of us in real time to give us more of what we ask for. I know what that's called. That's called a mirror.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly great opportunity for us to learn about ourselves.
You're saying it's why it's up to us. So we're
That's
learning
right.
about, and last question I'd love to ask you, I mean, you've been, as you said, the pick and axe, providing the pick and axe of Silicon Valley for 35 years. I travel around the world. Innovation is happening everywhere around the world. Is Silicon Valley still the beacon of innovation, or is it becoming much more distributed, as you make a case technology is?
I think that there will certainly be a time, I don't want to predict any particular time, but it's super important to realize that at different times in history, look at this country. There was a time when Pittsburgh was the center of innovation.
It's kind of coming back.
There was a time when Buffalo, New York was the center of innovation. It was the city of light. It's where electricity first really came, to America. Silicon Valley is the place where we figured out this digital revolution, but it may not be the place. It's almost certainly not going to be the place where we figure out the next biotech revolution. And I think that it is always important to be humble, and I don't see a lot of humility in Silicon Valley. And I also see a lot of wasted potential as people are chasing the payday. They're doing the tour of gas stations rather than trying to go somewhere interesting.
Yeah. So thoughtful. So Tim, thank you. I can highly recommend the book. I mean, it's a very thoughtful read. This isn't something you're gonna go through really quickly. You want to take time, think about it, your provocation. So good luck with WTF, what the future. Anyway, Tim, thanks a lot. Really good to see you. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. We'll see you next time.